Welcome to the 1662 Fellowship of North America, where we promote the historic Anglican formularies as the theological center of gravity for Orthodox Anglicanism in North America. I'm Isaac Rayberg, the Archdeacon for Liturgy in the Anglican Diocese of All Nations and the Rector of All Saints Anglican Church in San Antonio, Texas. And today I'm joined by a special guest, the Venerable Andrew Brashier, Rector of Good Shepherd in Birmingham, Alabama, and the curate of the Anglican Office for Education, Training, and Formation. At least as the time of recording, that's the way things are. How are you doing, Andrew?
Doing good. So good to be with you, Archdeacon, and it's a blessing to be able to chat with you today, and I just really enjoy the work that you're doing with the 1662 Fellowship.
Well, thank you. And I mean, you and I have collaborated on so many things over the years, from the old miserable offenders to I've been on your podcast once or twice.
Yeah,
and,
the Classic Anglican podcast. It was a great episode.
Yep.
I appreciate you doing that.
That was a lot of fun. Fun. So it's we're a small fishbowl in the Anglican world, and so it's good to have this reciprocity. So the reason why I'm having you on today is that you just published a new book, which is very much up our alley in the 1662 Fellowship. And that is Bishop Nowell's Middle Catechism. Bishop Nowell's Middle Catechism. So tell us a little bit about what a Middle Catechism is, about when was this in use, and why it's worth republishing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Nowell, he was the Dean of St. Paul's. He served as dean in two different instances. And during his tenure, he was a really interesting gentleman. He lived a long time, even by our standards. He was born in 1507 and dies in 1602, and so in the ripe age of his 90s there. And one of the many works he did was his Middle Catechism, which comes out, I believe, in the first edition in 1570. And there's also a 1572 edition, which is the one that I worked off of. And to make
this is still that first generation of English reformers. Yeah,
absolutely. And so if you're a listener who's kind of new to Anglican history, or Anglican history is not really your forte, which I understand, but in terms of the English Reformation, you have it ongoing from roughly, you could say, the 1520s. It starts up. It really gets going in the 1530s. It ebbs and flows. Cranmer is doing his work. The 1549 prayer book comes out, and then the 1552 comes out. But really, there's debate on if it ever actually hit the shelves or was used in the parishes before Bloody Mary takes the throne. But then after Bloody Mary, you have Queen Elizabeth I, and she does really a restoring of the Reformation in England. And so Nowell lives in that time period, that very turbulent time period of the early Reformation, the work that Cranmer and others are doing. He's one of the Marian exiles. He fled when Queen Mary came on board as the queen of the English realm, and then he returns to England to continue the Reformation. And his
do you
work,
know which of the where he fled to? Because there were kind of some different camps at the time. Was he part of that Genevan group or that Strasbourg group?
He was part of the Genevan group, and I'm not as familiar with the extent of his history in terms of did he move around a lot, or did he hang out in Geneva for the long period of time? I do know that he was for a period of time in Strasbourg, and he was in Frankfurt and became part of the dispute that was going on there in terms of the doctrine and the liturgy that was being used in the exile.
And over there were some people, some of the English wanted to use the prayer book. Others
some did not,
and there was a big fight in Frankfurt at the time.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm no expert on it, but from what I've gathered, quite honestly, from the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, it's a great edition that covers a lot of people if you're into this English history. It references that he actually ended up siding with John Knox, which is interesting on that issue. And so he's very reformed. They were all reformed, and reform was a broader term because they were all reformers of the Reformation. But what we come to know of today as the Reformed, he sided with them, at least according to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. And I'm real curious to kind of follow up and learn a little bit more about that. I would have disagreed with him.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I tend to see Knox not as the hero of that story. I tend to be more sympathetic with Jewel and some of those guys.
Likewise, and that's one of the reasons why, I naturally republished Jewel, and Jewel has a more prominent, he's a jewel, if you will, pun intended, of the English Reformation, and his apology for the Church of England, where he's doing a little bit of an early work of really focusing on Rome. There's a little bit in the apology about also, heading off the early proto-Puritans, let's call them. And then his disciple, Richard Hooker, really engages in that hard work in the laws of ecclesiastical polity of, fighting, papists to the left of me, Puritans to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with Richard Hooker. So
yeah. And Hooker's really more of that second generation. He's a little bit later, but he was taught by all those first generation guys.
He was. And I digressed a bit, but to get back to Nowell, it's interesting that he was there, in exile. He, of course, returns to England, and he becomes a chaplain to Bishop Edmund Grindal in 1560. He's given an archdeaconry at Middlesex in 1561, and then he's quickly elevated, because by the end of the year 1561, Dean of St. Paul's, and the Bishop of London in 1562 works with him and continues, giving him a prominent role, so that within a couple of years you have a convocation, which is, for those who are probably mostly Americans are listening to this. So if you're in the ACNA, we say our assembly. In this time period and to this day, it's the convocation of calling the clergy together in 1563, which is only a couple of years now that he's been the Dean of St. Paul. Not quite even 2 years yet, but he plays a prominent role, a prominent part. He's really been elevated during Elizabeth's reign. He's become good friends and has got a lot of credentials and a lot of backing, to where he is preaching, very, key sermons. For example, on the opening day, he preaches at Westminster Abbey for the opening of the concurrent Parliament at that time. And in it, he offends Queen Elizabeth. He calls upon her to marry. And this is a theme in his life. It's really, I'm laughing. It's funny to me now. It's quite bold. The man, definitely didn't hold back on his opinion.
Yeah, that was not a good career move, I'm sure, to offend Queen Elizabeth. Other folks did the same and did not end so good.
No, that is the truth, And according to at least one biographer of Elizabeth, there's a work that Alison Weir published called Elizabeth the Queen. Apparently, it was said that she never spoke a friendly word to him again, which you can imagine why. So,
she also tended to hold grudges. Yeah, this
is true. Yeah, but this doesn't diminish him in terms of his reputation with his clergy. Matthew Parker, who is the Archbishop, nominates him as the prolocutor of the lower house of convocation, and he's basically keeping up with the two houses, the upper house of bishops, the lower house of convocation, which would be representing the priests and the deacons. So they're communicating with each other. So a very key position in convocation. And this kind of friction that's going on between the Queen and between Nowell continues, because at one point, apparently he gives her, I'm trying to find a source on this, but I've been reading accounts that apparently she rebukes him for giving a prayer book that has pictures of saints and angels. And she essentially says, this is a little bit too Romish. What are you doing here? Which is fascinating to me, because he sides with Knox. He seems like he's more of the Reformed. And it's surprising that he gave such a prayer book. And then, and just 2 years later, in 1565, he's preaching, and the Queen is present. And Queen Elizabeth apparently interrupts him in his sermon. And because he's doing a sermon where he's directing it against a treatise that's been distributed at the time, a treatise of the cross, and he's starting to talk against crucifixes and how, we don't need crucifixes, we need to get rid of these things. And she says, you need to stick to the text of your sermon.
I think she had a crucifix in her chapel.
She has a crucifix in her chapel. So you see this tension going back and forth. And yet, two Nowell's credit, while like I very much have our dear Queen Bess's sympathies on this, and
Yeah.
yet I'm the guy who's republishing this Middle Catechism. But I find it fascinating because he is willing to speak his mind. It shows how Queen Elizabeth, she had her opinions, was very learned, but also there was this broad, reformational consensus that was
Yeah.
being built out and being developed in the English Reformation that we see to this day to a large extent. And he wasn't punished in the sense of, well, he's not going to be advanced in his career. We're not going to listen or read to his works. No, no, actually, quite the opposite. His catechisms, of which there's three, were elevated and used throughout the entire realm, throughout what we call Anglicanism, but would have been limited to the British Isles at this point.
He had a lot of conflicts with the Queen, and yet his catechism ends up being really important to the church in at least later generations. So what is with the development of his catechism? How did it get on the radar?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. He authors, and there's actually a little bit of scholarly questioning of who writes the shorter catechism that are in the classic books of common prayer, whether or not you're looking at the 1549 all the way up to the American 1928. You have
They're
the short
basically the same.
catechism.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're basically the same. There's like some minor variations. And for the most part, scholars agree that he is the author behind that catechism that Thomas Cranmer will put just before confirmation, because you need to be catechized before you're being confirmed. And that shorter catechism has long lasted the Book of Common Prayer. It did have a little bit of additions that were added to it, notably around the 1604 time period. I believe it was 1604, in which it really kind of drew out a little bit more about what you needed to know about the faith once delivered. But it follows the model that's used in so many of the Catholic, old ancient catechisms, of making sure that we understand the Ten Commandments, that we understand the gospel, specifically in the Western context of the Apostles' Creed, and then we learn, how do we pray by going through the Lord's Prayer and what that draws out theologically, so that you have a fundamental knowledge as a young person, typically, of what is the faith once delivered, so you are now prepared for confirmation. And that shorter catechism lasts for centuries and still lasts to this day. It's still being utilized. It's even referenced in the To Be a Christian catechism produced by ACNA. But we need more, and we've all acknowledged this. If you're a user of the classic prayer books, you've probably seen that you need a little bit more than just the shorter catechism. And during the early English Reformation, several catechisms were being utilized and leaned upon, including the Heidelberg Catechism.
Yeah,
Well,
Heidelberg was a big one, kind of
a
across
huge one.
jurisdictions. Yeah.
Very much so. And so Noel, what he gets to do is he gets to working on a longer catechism. Now we call it the longer catechism because he ends up making the one that I republished, the middle catechism. This
So
longer
middle
catechism.
implies a large
Yes,
catechism and a small catechism. It's somewhere in between.
exactly. And so he does it, but if you look at it, you think that, well, maybe he did the short, the middle, and the longer, kind of Goldilocks style.
Yeah.
But instead, no, it actually was the shorter one, then he does the longer one. And this kind of goes back to that convocation of 1563 I was talking about, where he gets the stamp of approval from the convocation to do a catechism. And in 1570, that work is published, the longer catechism, that is. Well, that longer catechism is quite long. It's not the longest thing in the world, but it's definitely long by our standards, our modern standards. It's a good catechism, and you can easily find it already republished. The middle catechism, however, has been out of print for really centuries at this point, until I republished this this middle catechism. And this is something that is done because there is some encouragement from bishops and from others of creating something a little bit slightly more manageable. And so the middle catechism is basically taking the longer one and editing it down, as any good editor does. And when he does this work of editing it down, it's quickly published by 1572. And so you have the middle catechism that has a longer shelf life than the longer catechism.
So about in terms of that longer versus middle, size wise, what are we talking in terms of comparison?
Yeah, you put me on the spot on that one. I'm trying to think of. I'm gonna cheat a little bit as we're chatting because I'm curious as well. But to give some context for the Middle Catechism, the Middle Catechism ends at, let's see, he didn't number his questions. He has several hundred questions when it comes to the Middle Catechism, and as
About the
memory
same
serves,
size as like to be a Christian then.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. That's a great point of context and reference point. And so that's why it's digestible. It's not something that even in our modern context that we kind of shirk away from. Whereas the longer one, as memory serves, the edition that I've seen is not numbered either, but it seems to run more in like a 200, maybe 300 range. And that's
Okay.
purely, kind of shooting from the hip, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Well, and that would be more actually the size of to be a Christian. To be a Christian is about 300 questions long, I believe.
Yeah, yeah.
And unless I should know this. I did podcasting through it, but yeah. So and my biggest difficulty when I was a long time ago teaching through it for in our parish was just that it was a solid 2.5 years to hit every question, look up the references in a half an hour Sunday school format. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
And I think that the advantage of the Middle Catechism is that you can utilize it in a shorter time frame, especially if you're looking to go through the basics of the Christian faith and you want to knock it out in time for Lent. It's a good resource to pick up and to utilize in order to get through the basics of the faith, but be able to educate and equip those who are new to the faith, or perhaps they're coming in from another tradition, and do it in such a manner in which you've knocked it out before you get into the Easter season. I've personally been there before where you start your catechism class with noble intentions, but you get great questions from the
Yeah.
laity, and you end up, extending and bumping out, and you realize I'm actually not going to get through what I want to get through before we get to Easter to actually do if it's an adult baptism or a confirmation, more typically, whatever may be the case. While we were chatting here, I was cheating and I was wrong. This is why I'm never been good at guessing distances, much less guessing pages or how many questions. So the Middle Catechism actually has 252 questions.
Okay.
So double my estimate there. And the longer catechism, I'm going to keep looking for because I'm curious now. But it was longer than 252.
Yeah, and to be a Christian has 368 questions. So
hmm
I mean to give some context. And yeah, we've all had that problem where just getting through a whole catechism can be tough, but that shorter catechism is a little underpowered for especially when you're dealing with adults who need to be catechized. And frankly, most of our adults need to be catechized.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that Archdeacon Isaac utilized the 28 that has that great little office of instruction that takes the shorter catechism and makes it into a twofold
Hmm.
liturgical office. And that's a great way to still incorporate the shorter catechism and be able to get it on people's lips and on their minds. And a
Yeah.
lot of people kind of sneeze at it, but it's really deep theologically. It's very beautiful, well written. And I think you can easily graduate from the shorter catechism, but you're still seeing the same responses echoed from that shorter catechism in the middle and longer. Not to mention in the To Be a Christian. Several times the shorter catechism is quoted outright. It's referenced, if you're wondering, it'll say like the 1662 catechism, I believe. I'm drawing off
Hmm.
the top of my head, but it references the catechism that's in the 1662 prayer book, which is the shorter
The shorter
catechism.
catechism. Yeah,
Mhm.
and I did. So my last time I did confirmation classes, I actually published those on this channel as well. I did it cross between the parish and the 1662 fellowship. I think in an 8 or 9 week class period, I took 2 of those weeks to go through the catechism as presented in the 28th office of instruction, which for considering it was all adults in this context, that was a pretty good one. We could have gone a lot deeper, but in terms of just those basic things, that worked out pretty good.
Yeah, yeah.
But we needed another 6 weeks of other prayer book and related things really do what I thought we should do.
And what I find interesting about the use of catechisms is that you can never look or review at a catechism enough. There's always
Right.
something else to draw from it. And in our own personal context, at the parish that I'm currently leading, in Good Shepherd, I introduced reading the catechism responsibly, and I was inspired by the 1928 Office of Instruction. We've done that as well, and then to supplement that shorter catechism, we'll utilize to be a Christian catechism. My bishop encouraged me just do it before the service starts, and so I've obeyed that instruction. And I drew it from, used to in the 1604 canons, it was expected to do evening prayer and that you do catechesis on Sunday evenings at evening prayer. It didn't always work out from what little I've read. How did that work out historically? So I was thinking, how in this modern day, how could we bring this to the forefront? And so that's one way that I've tried to skin the cat. You can also do a Sunday school class or a catechetical class, which I encourage. But if you're like most people, you don't always get the people who show up on Sunday morning just for service. So we do that as a Q&A, reading it aloud back and forth responsively, akin to how you may do the Psalter. So that's one way to incorporate any catechism that is authorized in your particular province or jurisdiction or diocese.
So you said that Nowell's Middle Catechism had the longest shelf life, or longer shelf life between his middle and his longer. What was kind of led to its popularity, and when was its heyday? About what time period?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this comes about because, in part, it's popular, it's shorter, it's probably, practically speaking, cheaper, as the printing press is still relatively new at this time period. And therefore, it gets official canonical endorsement in the 1604 canons. Now, this is post-dating Thomas Cranmer, because Cranmer is martyred several decades well before this. But it was one of Cranmer's projects to have the canon law reformed, and he's not able to get it accomplished in his lifetime. It eventually is accomplished just a couple years after Nowell dies in 1602. And he dies in 1602. The 1604 canons obviously are in 1604, and those canons elevate his catechism as essentially the official catechism outside of the prayer book. It commends those canons. It commends that middle catechism to be read, utilized throughout the realm. And so therefore it's used along with other catechisms. Heidelberg still has quite the shelf life for some time in the English realms. But Nowell is extremely popular. It has the endorsement of being used. And therefore when the canons mention that they must minister and catechize to servants, children, those who are not baptized, the catechism, it's really a dual reference of the one that's within the prayer book. And it's also holding up the one that Nowell has written and that has been adopted within the 1604 canons as an authority to go to. And so therefore the Middle Catechism continues being utilized for several centuries. And even in the early 1800s, it's translated into Welsh. And so just looking at that fact alone, you can see that it's utilized. But I don't want to give people the wrong impression, like it's the only catechism. It's not, to be honest with you, but it is extremely popular and would be more common than not in terms of what is used after you've gone through the short catechism in the prayer book.
And for any listeners that haven't looked too deeply into those 1604 canons, they were the canon law for the Church of England until 1964. I mean, this was a solid 360 years. These were the ones on the books, and they influenced the way that most of the daughter churches, including the Episcopal Church here in the States, I'm sure the Church of Wales, Ireland, everybody was doing things when they were formed. And so, the 1604 canons commending Nowell's catechism is a pretty big deal. Even if it wasn't always used in later years, it's still there on the books.
Absolutely. And it's a good reference point, especially as you're looking at the shorter catechism even today. Because you may say, like, well, it's not official here in the United States. It's no longer given authority in England, so why would it be relevant? Well, you see where it really ties into a fuller development of what is the faith once delivered, still related to that short catechism in the classic prayer book, which is still being echoed and utilized even in the To Be a Christian catechism. So it's an excellent resource in terms of, I want to go a little bit deeper. You read a Q&A that's coming from the shorter catechism, and if you're wanting to go into a little bit more depth, or quite frankly, if you're a parent and you're utilizing that small catechism, I encourage you to use it.
Hmm.
And those, those small people have big minds and great big questions, and you're kind of stumped on like, I don't know where to go to. Well, you can pick up the Nowell's Middle Catechism, and you see the same thought, the same theology, going a little bit deeper into, what is the faith that we have been gifted.
So, did you have to make any significant textual changes? I know you said that part of the publishing this was that it just hasn't been for so long,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
like, was there any modernization of spellings of those days, and or any kind of organizing it in a way that would be better for folks today?
Yeah, and so to that point, my goal in this work was to let Noel speak for himself, but I did make some small edits, not a modernization as I've done in another project, which was with Bishop Edmund Grendel's Family Prayers, whom Noel essentially worked for,
Hmm.
served under as dean. And so there's a kind of a tie there. But with that work, I updated the language because we did not yet have the 2019 Book of Common Prayer, and I wanted a modernized version of the 1928 family prayers. And not all of the family prayers in the 28 um, are utilized. There's some that they edited and put in the 28, but Bishop Grindle had a whole selection, and so I wanted to republish it and do it in an updated, slightly modernized language for families. But to answer your question, the Middle Catechism, I left in his words, made minor changes like taking the British spellings. We like to use a Z where they'll use an S, for example. Also update one or two what we would consider misspellings because we've standardized the English language. So I didn't want that to be a distraction, and beyond that, really just using an editor's touch in order to make sure that it really reads a lot easier by giving a clarity in terms of bolding questions, so you can
Hmm.
see here's the question, here's the answer. Just some light editorial work, so it pops, if you will, a little bit better as you're looking through it and reading it.
Something like the homilies. I I love having a copy of the homilies in, without the modernization. Like, Lee Gaddis's modernization is a great project, but I like having the actual homilies. But it
Yes.
drives me bananas when folks quote from them with the original spelling, because it's not
Yeah.
necessary. I mean, it
Yeah.
was republished so much with
Hmm.
standardized spelling that you don't need to do that. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
that's good. Like, don't
And my
have
my thought on that
V's where
too
there
is,
shouldn't be, where there's U's.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so my kind of thought on that was, I kept the language where like he may put a thee in there, for example, or
Hmm.
a thy, and that's not too concerning. But if he's spelling virtue, ver,
Right.
cure, that can be distracting, and especially if you're teaching. I wanted to utilize this so that if you're teaching with your children and you're going through the classic prayer book, well, it's similar language. And then just like the classic prayer books don't have quote misspellings, as this older work would, then to have standard, English spelling, so it's also not throwing them off. Because I can
Yeah.
imagine in a homeschool context, or even if you're not homeschooling, you're just reading with your children at school, and they're like, wait, that doesn't look right, or you don't want to teach them wrong by accident. So that was part of the philosophy. And the other thing I need to add, which I think is really the biggest contribution, is going through one of the editions of his Middle Catechism that had scriptural references, but it was using an older citation system. And this is what took
Hmm.
me the longest thing to figure out how to decipher. And once I figured it out, I updated, well, I guess I clarified the citations. It's the citations from one of the editions that was published. But instead of having it where you just couldn't tell where in the book of Acts is this referencing, I would clarify that after this question, it's Acts 11, verse 16, so that you can actually go and utilize those scriptural references. I didn't update them if they looked kind of interesting or odd, and I'll admit there's a couple of scriptural citations where like interesting, why was this verse utilized in support? But I left that as is. I won't know to speak for himself.
Yeah, well, that's great. So this is available on Amazon, and I'll make sure to keep or include a link in the show notes, both on the audio and the video of this. And this is great work. This is your third project now with republishing something that should not have
It
fallen out
is.
of publication.
Yeah, it is. Like I guess technically, like my first work, A Faith for Generations, is like one part my own original content of where I was encouraged to publish my work on trying to do family prayer, and it's not a guide of like how to do it and do it well. It's not that. It's really just a personal journey of here's things that worked for me, didn't work, and I share it. And then the back half of that work, which is really what I think is worth buying, is the second part of it is republishing Bishop Edmund Grindle's a little booklet that he authorized for his Diocese of London to utilize for praying at home. And part of that was adapted and put into the 1928 Book of Common Prayer. Very lovely, but also had a lot of prayers for different circumstances. And so that was in the first work I did, A Faith for Generations. Then I did Bishop John Jewell's two treatises on Scripture and the Sacraments, which is a great, walkthrough in terms of Bishop Jewell's views on the sacraments, on the authority of Scripture, and it's really a good companion after you read the Apology to kind of see like where is he taking us during this English Reformation, written at the same time period that all this is going about. And then I also add a last plug on Nowell's Middle Catechism. One of the other benefits that I add to it is updating the scripture citations so that they're usable. And then also the addition that I utilize is one in which there are a set of prayers for scholars, as it
Oh.
says, at the back end of the catechism. And it's just some very long, by our standards, prayers, but beautiful prayers really geared towards those who are learning, not only the catechism, but just in general. And so for students of all ages, including myself, you're never too old to learn. We never stop learning. It's a great way to pause, reflect, and really pray to the Lord for the wisdom that only He can give.
Well, that's excellent. Well, thank you so much, Archdeacon Andrew, for publishing this. Thanks for being on the show. And we'll have you back to talk about Jewel sometime, I'm sure, and maybe Grindle as well. Yeah, we know those prayers, even if we don't know that we know those prayers. So
Amen.
it's going to be good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Archdeacon. God bless.
God bless.